Hi everyone, this is Ashley Smith here, and this little video is going to be a bit of a brief introduction to moment form, and also it gives you a bit of an information as to the listening experience that results from listening to moment form music. In a nutshell, moment form consists of music that is composed in discontinuous autonomous units. And we're going to unpack exactly what that means in a moment. What results, or what's anticipated that will result from listening to these discontinuous autonomous musics, is an anti-teleological listening mode where the listener concentrates on the present moment rather than their listening mode existing in sort of a narrative or some sort of linear forward direction. First of all, we're going to have a quick look at the context in which moment form arose. Moment form was first promulgated in the early 1960s by Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, who was a prominent member of what we call the Darmstadt School. It was a music school that was prominent in the 1950s. And the Darmstadt composers, so other people involved in Darmstadt in the 1950s include people like Boulez and Luigi Nono, and these composers composed in a style or in a method using what we call integral serialism, which is where every single parameter of the music is serialized. It's been tightly organized. So these parameters not only include pitch, which is what Schoenberg had introduced serialism toward, but other parameters such as timbre and dynamics and even articulation are serialized in integral serial music. But one of the problems with integral serialism is that when we organize every single element inside the music, the type of sounds that result are largely undifferentiated from music that is completely disorganized. And I'm showing you two buildings here at the moment. One of them is exploding, and this building represents integral serial music. Even though it is tightly organized, what we actually perceive is sort of an implosion of the structure. It's actually really difficult to be able to hear the organization of the musical structure. However, in architecture, in the 1950s, they were actually doing exactly the same thing. They were organising every single element of the structure according to the dimensions of the human being, or what Le Corbusier called the modular man. And I find it really interesting that in architecture, it results in this really tightly organised structure, whereas in music, when we serialize all the elements, it actually causes the sound world to completely implode. And that's tied to the intangible, abstract nature of music that separates it from the other art forms. So this idea of the sound world itself imploding in the integral serial aesthetic became a problem for the composers of the Darmstadt School in the 1950s. And Stockhausen himself recognised that there was a problem. Roger Smalley articulated this problem in a really nice way when he said that the procedure of integral serialism gave way to some fairly improbable musical situations, as well as a widespread lack of understanding on the part of listeners. Composers soon realised that the scale of organisation would have to be expanded if the musical processes were to be clearly followed, and that new systems of organisation, more broadly based and more inclusive, would have to be developed. So this new form of musical organisation, something more broadly based and more inclusive, is what Stockhausen came up with in moment form. And initially, moment form arose kind of as a defence. It was a philosophical defence that Stockhausen made for his work Contact, and also it was used as a bit of a blueprint for an upcoming work, that Stockhausen was writing, that would finally receive a performance in 1963, and that work itself is called Moment. Let's hear Stockhausen's own thoughts on what moment form are. And it's really interesting that in Stockhausen's first lectures on moment form it's very much a philosophical idea. The actual techniques of the form haven't really yet been clearly defined. So in these philosophical discussions, Stockhausen would talk about a musical form that would concentrate on the present moment. And he says that this concentration on the present moment is like a vertical cut across horizontal time perception. And it's in this vertical cut that Stockhausen is able to find an eternity that exists in the present moment. So what Stockhausen is doing is he's kind of slicing up time, and he's forcing the listener not to worry about what's happened in the past or what might be happening in the future. So he's kind of ruining the idea of implication in music, and instead he's wanting the listener to concentrate just on the present moment, that special present moment. And for Stockhausen, this philosophical idea was tied to the notion of overcoming the concept of time and even duration in music. So later on, several composers, as well as Stockhausen, who were writing in moment form, were able to articulate exactly what writing in moment form meant. And here we have the key tenets of moment form. So the most important aspect is this idea of autonomous musical units. So in a way, a moment form composition consists of lots of mini musical compositions whose materials are completely unrelated to one another, and they juxtapose with one another as well. So it's lots of smaller musical compositions that are unrelated, and they contrast with one another. The notion of arbitrary succession means that it really doesn't matter how these mini musical compositions are ordered in the larger musical work. And in fact, there are many moment form pieces which use a technique which we call mobile form, where it's actually up to the performer, or it's completely indeterminate as to the order in which these moments occur. Another aspect of moment form is its modular structure. Now, because the structure is modular and any one of these autonomous units can appear at any moment, it also implies the idea that there's actually a sense of endlessness to it. We can constantly add to the structure and we can take away from the structure without compromising its aesthetic integrity. Here we come onto a couple of really complex terms when we describe moment form's polyvalent and non-hierarchical nature. Now, what this means is that there's no one particular musical parameter which dominates another. And this is largely a response, especially in the 1950s, to the movement away from the hierarchical domination of pitch. So instead, any musical parameter can inform a moment form composition. So timbre, texture, rhythm, instrumentation, all of these aspects have equal importance alongside pitch. And that also implies that there's going to be a great diversity of materials. Now, the idea of non-coercion refers to how moment form compositions never include ideas that thematically develop in sort of that 19th century Germanic sense. Instead, ideas are transformed and may reappear in new guises, rather than sort of being subject to progressive transformation. One of my favourite ways of being able to show how moment form works is to actually think of it in terms of architecture. And a piece of architecture that you're very familiar with the UWA Conservatorium of Music, I really consider this building to be a moment form structure. It's a modular piece of architecture where the buildings themselves are independent, autonomous units, and there's a sense of endlessness in that we can constantly add to the different aspects of this architecture. So let's get inside this idea. So we have autonomous units, and we see this in terms of how the rooms inside the school are completely separated from one another by this system of beams and columns. Now you'll notice that in the School of Music, all of the rooms are of very, very different proportions, and they're kind of stacked on top of each other and next to each other in a really arbitrary way. So we have this idea of autonomous units and arbitrary succession. And we also have a non-hierarchical interaction of these differing components and also the differing materials that make up the School of Music. So you'll see that we've got these concrete columns and beams, and then we've got these, we've got some beautiful glass and wood materials, as well as the cinder block materials, and these all interact in a non-hierarchical manner. And then here we are just looking at sort of the modular aspect of the building. The School of Music, it's actually incomplete. Many of you will probably know that there was actually meant to be another 10 practice rooms added to the building, but it was easy to take away those 10 practice rooms from the design of the building because it's a modular structure. And we can see this aspect of endlessness in the modular structure in how these beams here remain incomplete. Now we get on to one of the trickier concepts that is an integral part of moment form, and it's the idea of polyvalency. Now this means how the individual person who's experiencing the piece of music or experiencing the architecture will develop their own understanding and their own reading or interpretation of the work. And if we consider something like the Sydney Opera House, we can see that we're able to develop multiple formal readings of the Sydney Opera House. We're able to read the building as being the beautiful sails that sit on the Sydney Harbour, or we can actually perceive it of the form in an entirely different way. We can see the form in terms of its origins as part of a hemisphere, as what we see in the photograph on the right. But it also is connected to the way the person interacts with the building as well. So we see polyvalency in terms of how a performer who goes into the Sydney Opera House through the green room and onto the stage is going to have a very different experience of the building from someone who is maybe an audience member who comes in through the enormous ramp of stairs at the front of the building and enters through the auditorium through the really grand foyer. So, and the same applies for music as well, is that it becomes the responsibility of the listener to make sense of the music, and the composer deliberately allows the audience to experience this special freedom. The listener is given agency rather than being fed a particular form in a really concrete way. So, to recap on the conditions of a pure moment form work, and I've used the word pure here because moment form throughout its 60-year history has actually changed shape in many ways, and these ideas have been relaxed. However, the pure conditions mean that we can never have ideas return. There can be no sense of continuation or development in the 19th century sense. That between the autonomous music units that we're listening to is that there's no sense of implication or growth or goal direction. Tied to the idea of endlessness, that there's a de-emphasis on closure. Then we have the idea that all the parameters inside the music are operating in a non-hierarchical way. So for instance, pitch is not going to dominate the organisation of the music. And we see that there's great diversity in the materials used. However, these materials are assimilated. they're applied in a non-coercive manner rather than being integrated into the structure in a sort of 19th century developmental sense. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to have a quick play for you of a piece of music which I regard as being a moment form piece. And this is Dutilleux's Mystère d'Instant. And this piece was composed between 1985 and 1989 and actually was very different for Dutilleux's compositional approach. Dutilleux normally used a method which he referred to as progressive growth, which would involve slow and continuous morphing of thematic material and the use of motives that would gradually become more and more recognisable throughout a composition. However, Mystère was actually a bit of an experiment for Dutilleux, and he instead was playing around with the moment form idea. Let's have a look at some discontinuous autonomous units in Mystère. So Mystère is made up of 10 movements, and we can think of these movements as being moments, and they really sharply contrast with one another so that the listener is forced into concentrating on the present moment. Let's have a quick listen to the fifth movement, and in this movement it has a really distinct texture in that the strings are in unison in this sort of impassioned chant-like melody. So here we have that really definitive texture of that unison with the strings. I should have mentioned that this piece is composed for strings, percussion and cimbalom. Let's move on to the sixth movement now, and we're going to see how this contrasts really sharply with the previous texture that we just heard. Now this is a chorale, and it's like a homophonic melody with these sends of vibrato lower strings that almost sound like a viol consort. We're listening almost to a completely different composition. So we can see that that music is completely unrelated to the music we've heard before, and we're forced to concentrate just on what's happening in that present moment. Now the next moment is really cool. What happens in this one is that the texture changes again, and harmonically it changes as well. And what we have here instead are layered glissandos. So what results is a composition that is made up of independent autonomous units. In the case of Mystère by Dutilleux, it consists of 10 independent moments, and we can see that there's enormous textural, harmonic and rhythmic contrast between these moments. And in fact, we could quite easily rearrange these moments into a different order, and it really wouldn't have much effect on the structural and aesthetic integrity of the work. And importantly, the listening mode for this is one in which we're not thinking about progressive growth and teleological forwards direction, but instead the listener is left to concentrate on the present moment. There's a bit of a rundown of moment form, and if you want to listen to some more, go and have a listen to some Stockhausen works from around the 1960s, such as Moment and Contact, or you might even go and have a listen to some works by Roger Smalley, such as Pulses, which are some really cool works in moment form. One of my favourite forms to listen to. Thanks so much for listening. Bye-bye.